This week, Russian President Vladimir Putin said he plans to strengthen his country's nuclear forces, and that was after suspending the last nuclear arms control treaty with the United States. So, to take a closer look at this and what it might mean for the global community, we're joined by Derek Johnson. He's the managing partner at Global Zero, an international initiative for nuclear disarmament. Derek, thank you for making time for us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Derek, let's begin with the START treaty, because for most of us, we heard that Russia was pulling away from it, but no real clear sense of what exactly that means. Help us understand.
Yeah, so what Russia has announced is not a withdrawal, but a suspension. And that means, the sky isn't falling, but this is bad news. There's just no way around that. Russia and the United States control 90% of the nuclear weapons on the planet. New START is the last binding restraint on these arsenals. It limits both sides to an equal number of deployed weapons. It provides verification measures to ensure neither country is cheating on those obligations, and a whole array of mechanisms to create more transparency and reduce the opportunities for misunderstandings between these two countries. It's critically important stuff. And this treaty it's an essential guardrail against arms racing. And it's part of an entire international infrastructure that was built after the Cold War to help keep nuclear weapons in check. Now, that infrastructure has taken some serious hits over the last few years, particularly under the Trump administration. And we lost a couple of really important treaties, stripped away a lot of the speed limits and road signs and off-ramps. And New START's really all that's left. So Putin's announcement to suspend the treaty it's dangerous. It's gonna heighten the risks of escalation in Ukraine and move the world sort of one step closer to nuclear chaos.
Nuclear chaos. Okay, so this issue keeps coming up ever since this war began, and we go back and forth as to how seriously we should be taking this. Is this a bluff, or is this really going like a real possibility of nuclear warfare?
Yeah, I think, it's very natural, very tempting to say, oh, Putin's bluffing, that no one in their right mind would use nuclear weapons. I hear that a lot. But you can't risk hundreds of millions of lives on that kind of wishful thinking. I personally think the main risk of nuclear use in Ukraine is it's accidental escalation that sort of springs out of the fog of war rather than a calculated, deliberate decision by Putin to go nuclear, because it's frankly hard to see what that's going to gain him. But I certainly wouldn't rule it out. Ukrainian forces massing for a counteroffensive, that could be a very tempting target, especially given how badly Russia's conventional forces are performing. But I think more importantly on that question, we already know that Putin is capable of major miscalculation and bad decision making. This is a man who believed he could take Kyiv in 48 hours, and he sent 100,000 troops across the border on the basis of that belief. And now, here we are 1 year later with, tremendous and lasting damage done to Russia economically and politically. He's being beaten back by forces a fraction of the size of Russia's army. NATO is more unified than ever. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have led his mobilization efforts. He's reviled as a war criminal around the world, and his standing with close partners like China, it's starting to show some cracks. So it's not exactly a ringing endorsement of his judgment. Mm-hmm. I think we just don't have the luxury of assuming this is a bluff. There's too much at stake.
So Derek, if Putin is being pushed more and more into a corner and getting further and further isolated, which means he has less to lose, we're in a far more precarious situation than we were a year ago. So how does the international community respond to this to make sure we don't find ourselves in the midst of a nuclear war?
Yeah, it's a tough needle to thread, but reducing the risk of escalation without making concessions to Putin is what we're going to have to do. Risk of escalation is real, but submitting to this kind of nuclear blackmail has its own dangers. This is a war that has had a nuclear dimension from the start. It launched under the cover of Russia's nuclear arsenal, and Putin has made nuclear threats and sort of saber rattling a consistent through line. I think the good news is that what we've seen so far from the United States, from NATO, it's been pretty good. It's been a good balance of resolve and restraint. When Putin's making nuclear threats, you see the West is very intentionally not matching that rhetoric. We're not talking about our own nuclear weapons. We're not making reciprocal threats or taking steps to bring nuclear weapons closer to the conflict. Instead, you see President Biden and other NATO leaders call this behavior out as reckless, it's unacceptable, and that's how the world's going to have to continue to respond without taking its collective foot off the gas in terms of providing Ukraine with the support it needs, which is the thing that Putin really wants to happen, right? Because rewarding Putin's behavior in that way would just set a really dangerous precedent. That's not a recipe for peace in our time. He's doing this because he's losing. And I think, backing down in the face of nuclear threats is going to increase the likelihood that Putin continues to use this approach again in the future. And it also sends a really dangerous message to other autocrats in the world who are watching this very closely. Depending on how this plays out, they're either going to learn that nuclear weapons are hugely advantageous or they don't actually get what you want. And I think it's pretty obvious what the lesson needs to be.
Put a point on that for me. What is the lesson that needs to be learned? That you can't, nuclear weapons are not going to leave you in a material better position. That a nuclear armed country can't invade its non-nuclear neighbor under the cover of nuclear weapons. We can't allow that to be sort of the lesson coming out of the war. Okay. Lesson learned. Derek Johnson, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.